Okay, test, test. We good, Ralph? Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Eugene's January 30th, 2026 program, What You Need to Know About the Kalapuya. My name is Thomas Hiura. I serve as president of City Club, and it's my honor to welcome you to another of the many forums we've held since 1990 in the name of our mission to build community vision through open inquiry. We are on the road today at the Many Nations Longhouse on the UO campus. It's a different location, but the same City Club. We're fortunate to be a trusted, open, and independent voice for Eugene area community members to be heard. And as a lifelong Eugenian, I believe the community is fortunate to have the City Club, and particularly to hear from our program guests and questions from the audience. That's true whether you are in our usual home of the Wow Hall, here at the Longhouse, watching the live stream online, or listening over the radio. Anyone who attends a City Club forum has equal access to asking questions in our space. We believe these gatherings and broadcasts around critical topics strengthen the community building work we do in so many sectors of Eugene. And in today's fractured information landscape, we want to be a space where you can participate in unearthing, disseminating, and sharing relevant information in conversation together. We'd love for you to browse all our past programs at cityclubofueugene.org or our YouTube or Facebook. Please consider becoming a member if you'd like to support our rigorous volunteer work as Oregon's only city club that provides weekly forums. There are many ways to partner with us, and I'd like to briefly thank our Diamond community sponsors. The University of Oregon has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically since 1876. Get more information at uoregon.edu. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. Thank you to the City of Eugene and to Lane County for their generous support, and to our web host, 9 Planets, whose website support is critical to our functioning, making it easy to sign up as a member or to learn more about us. A quick reminder, please silence all cell phones in the space. And with that, I proudly turn the mic over to my colleague on the program committee, Joel Corin.
How many of us have attended a meeting that started out, this gathering place is located on Kalapuya Ilihi land, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following the treaties of 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. You'll learn much more about the history and current history of the Kalapuya people today. We are lucky to have the preeminent scholar of the Western Oregon tribes and his book, Tribal Histories of Willamette Valley. And you could probably get a business card from him and order one yourself after the program. David Lewis is a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, descendant of the Takelma, Chinook, Malala, and Santiam Kalapuya peoples of Western Oregon. His research focuses on the tribal histories of Northwest coastal peoples, particularly the Western Oregon tribe. He served as the director of the Southwest Oregon Research Project collection at the UO, and was the culture department manager of the Grand Ronde tribe for 8 years. David earned his doctorate in anthropology from the U of O and now teaches full-time at the Department of Anthropology and Indigenous Studies at OSU School of Language, Culture, and Society. More than 500 of David's research essays about the histories of the tribes are published in his blog, The Quartux, and he'll correct me if I mispronounce that, Quartux journal at NDN History Research, ndnhistoryresearch.com. You'll also, if you read the Register Guard, he was quoted in an article about how he got the name Oregon, and that article appeared about last week. It's with great pleasure that I turn the microphone over to David.
Thanks, guys. This is, I think, my third time doing a City Club event. Who remember the last one? Okay, yeah, that was Kalapuya County, right? How's that going? Not well. All right. Anyway, so it's good to hear. It's good to be invited to these things. I like to talk about tribal history, as you can imagine. Good to see some friends in the audience, like Alice here in front. And I worked for a couple hours on this morning, and so it'll be sort of new and old slides together in a new presentation. So let's just continue. I only have about half an hour, and I usually go for about 45 minutes. So you guys start pulling me off the stage when we get to about half an hour, right? Okay, so just to introduce the Kalapuyans up here. Here's a map of them, of their lands. It's a generalized map. We don't know exactly where their lines were, if they had lines. Clearly didn't have fences, but lots of different tribes were in the valley. Malans on the east side, Kalapuyans in the center and west side, and some Chinook people in the north. And the Kalapuyas went all the way into the Umpqua Basin, as you can tell by the Yoncalla claim down in the south. So quite a few tribes in this area, and we are absolutely in the south of this map. And we'll talk a little bit about each of the tribes. Here's a copy of what's called their Kalapuya calendar. Collected from people at the Grand Ronde Reservation, which is where all the Kalapuyans went to Grand Ronde in 1856. They they kept an understanding of what their seasons were like, what plants they harvested, and so I've been looking at this calendar for years and realizing it's really kind of a calendar of what they did throughout the year in terms of harvesting mainly plants. We don't see a lot of references to hunting or fishing on here, and so this really suggests they spend a lot of time with plants, harvesting plants, which kind of belies all the older sort of stereotypes that are produced by anthropology about Native people always, trying to hunt down game or fishing. They actually spend a lot of time with plants. So I put together a little bit of a seasonal round, what maybe their season may have looked like. I'm not going to go into great detail about that because, again, I have very little time. So basically different kind of encampments throughout the year, weaving camps, berry camps, hunting camp. They go to trade gatherings, any kind of excess resources they have, we would trade. Usually up on the Columbia somewhere, and in around August, September, they would set fires on the prairie here and burn off the excess, now dead grasses on the prairie. So that's kind of the way they worked out. Their winter villages were kind of 3 or 4 months in your village, because at that time, 200 years ago, it was much colder than it is today. We are clearly in a warming trend from the 19th century to now. So these are some of their main staples: camas, wapato, which you don't see much around here. I've heard there is some around here, but I don't think there was as much wapato in the Southern Valley as the Northern Valley, because we find the wapato belts sort of along the Columbia down to Wapato Lakes in Washington County, down to Lake LaBiche, but then south of Salem, the wapato quantities seems to decline quite a bit. Other staples would be acorns and then hazelnuts too. So their food prep was, much like anybody else. Even nowadays, we try to put stuff away for the wintertime, freezing it or drying it out or something, and or canning it. And so they would do the same thing. They seem to like drying out all their foods, their meats, their fishes, their all the plant foods they would gather, the roots and everything else. They would cook it up, dry it out, and then rehydrate in the wintertime, so that they wouldn't necessarily have to go outside in that cold, wintry weather for a few months. In around probably March, they would start to get a little bit out of food, and so they would have to go out and start hunting. And there is a note on the calendar that we just saw a minute ago about them collecting camas root before it blooms. So camas then becomes, at that point, a starvation crop. They know where it is. It doesn't move very fast, so they know how to gather it pretty easily. And before it blooms or comes up out of the ground, it's still pretty good eating. So there you go. So that's kind of their process. We have that in their oral histories for drawing out all their foods. This area was mainly, Eugene area was mainly the Chafin Kalapuyans. What I've come to understand is this area was pretty much a seasonal wetland. Lots and lots of water here. The area of downtown Eugene was a giant wetland. When Eugene Skinner came here in 1846, 47, he was told by the Kalapuyans to place your cabin up there on the butte because it's really wet on this flatland down here, and that's what he did. And so that's why we have Skinner Butte. So they clearly would have taken their own advice, and all of the accounts of them living in the Eugene, Springfield area was them up at a higher altitude, usually on a hillside or up on top of a hill, away from the seasonal flooding. In Eugene City and Eugene, there was a lot of settler engineering of that, which we'll talk about in a minute, but this is all wetland area. I mean, the whole area between Amazon and over towards Pleasant Hill was all wetland area. In fact, Elijah Bristow, there's accounts of him deciding to place himself at Pleasant Hill because it was too wet in the valley floor. And he came at the same time as Skinner, as you know. And then tribes would then set fire over this moist wetland in the midsummer to September time period. And I think the moisture had something to do about mitigating the effect of that fire on the plants and the animals and everything else. We have a little more information about the Chafin now than I did 10 years ago. I was able to go through a lot of Joel Palmer's notes that now suddenly appear online. And for whatever reason, I had ignored all of the invoices and abstracts back in the day, because who cares about numbers? So I'm like, wait a minute, there's all kinds of numbers here, and they mention the tribes, and they're getting supplies. And so we have, I figured out there are abstracts for their supplies in 1855 for the Winfully, the Chelamela, the Chamafo, the Mountain Malala, the Mohawk, and the Chafin, which you see right in front of you. So, and this suggests they were all organized tribes, bands in the area, and they were signing or about to sign the treaty or had signed the treaty already. So they're getting treaty goods that they're promised in the ratified treaty, which is ratified in March 3rd, 1855. So, and this one mentions some of the men who actually appear in some of the stories in our Lane County historical accounts. This guy Tom, who was a chief, Jim Vaughn, who was sub-chief, another Jim, a guy named Whitehead, Bob, and another John. So there's a lot of, they began adopting sort of American names. That was kind of an honorific thing, and they were pretty well known in the area. And so eventually they were moved to Grand Ronde in 1856. Eugene back then, or this is not even back then, this is later on, was still kind of a forest in a sense. I was able to go online on the Oregana yearbooks from University of Oregon, and we had some really cool photos appear in the junior yearbook from 1903. That's downtown Eugene right there in the upper corner. So way different from today. There's Skinner's Butte. That whole land is basically farmland right at that point. There's Spencer's Butte, and we see a lot of pictures appear in these yearbooks of water, people doing water sports, canoeing on the rivers. So water was a pretty big theme back then, and there was a lot of it around. So people just played in it, were out sport fishing in it, doing all kinds of whatever they wanted to do. So the valley has takes on somewhat of a different character when you begin thinking about the wetland character of it. It's much wetter back then than it is today because we've done stuff like drain tiling and ditching to drain it all off for farming, because in the mid-20th century, everybody decided that, all the people that are important apparently, decided that the valley was beginning to become an agricultural mecca for Oregon, so they could make up a lot of money at that, get wealthy on that. But before that, we have explorers coming around and describing the valley. We have, David Douglas coming in 1825, and he's walking down through the valley, and he's talking about most of the valley being burnt in September, and there being patches of basically wetlands. And then he has some information from the Kalapuyans about what they're doing after the fire. They're collecting wild honey and the burnt grasshoppers, which they grind up and eat themselves. And they dig the camas root. So probably, and he's coming in September, so I'm thinking that he may have seen them digging camas even in September. So that's even a late summer activity. So David Douglas is pretty good at that, at giving information. But we also had the Wilkes Expeditionary Southern Expedition that came down through the valley in 1841, and they describe it. We have George Emmons here and James Dana describing how the whole valley floor is all burnt, and they're walking from basically Salem down past Eugene on mainly the west side, and they're describing this whole, and here's actually an image from their journal, which doesn't appear in the Wilkes journals for whatever reason. I don't know if Wilkes ever saw those things when he wrote his books, but really interesting maps, drawings of the valley in about our area, right here. So basically, it looks like the Kalapuyans were basically burning off the land, all the prairies. Each band had their own prairies they would burn off, and women were basically in charge of that. They would know exactly when they'd be told, or they were the ones that deciding when to burn off certain prairies. Essentially, the wind has to go away from you, and it didn't actually burn off or affect much of the settlers at first, because they're doing it every year. There's not much fuel. It's called a cool burn, so they're not really burning down houses or anything like that at that point. And then we have more in the journals, the Wilkes journals, and they talk later on when they get to the Long Tom about how much water there is on the land, and in many places wet and miry, and the whole thing being flooded after a few hours of rain. So they had just gone through in their journals a time period of basically what they call freshets or summer storms. And these sort of swales appear right after a summer storm that usually stick around for a couple days, and they drain away slowly to the river. So that I've talked to some geologists about that. That's because we had, on the west side of the valley at least, this layer of gray clay that comes out of the Coast Range, and that provides something of a water barrier and allows the swaling to appear for a while. And so we have more of that description from Henry Eld and George Emmons. They are September 10th, 1841, at the base, basically the estuary of the Long Tom, and they see this big lake structure, 80 feet in width, 3/4 of a mile in length, and about a foot deep. And so that is a giant sort of like swale that will probably disappear in a few days if it doesn't rain. So there's further evidence. I started looking for more, and this all helps me understand the culture of the Kalapuyans, how they lived, what plants they used, and perhaps gives us a clue as to what kind of cultural methods they may have used, right? So we see some of the GLO maps from below. They call it Marysville here, which is now Corvallis. And all the blue area here where I've hatched for you is all wet prairie, which we interpret as wet Camas Prairie, because Camas grows really well down that area. And then we have a place down south of Eugene called Camas Swale, and we have ethnographic accounts of people saying, yeah, we see Indians go down there digging Camas all the time. And we have other accounts from Elizabeth Wilkinson and Ann Whitaker, pretty well-known settlers in the area, of Camas Swale, how big it was, how important it was, and native people collecting from that swale. A giant swale now pretty much gone, taken over by Crestwell. So that's how the valley used to be. It used to be before a project called the Willamette Valley Project came into existence. And the federal government spent millions and perhaps at the later stages billions of dollars on building all the dams and the water control in the valley to help the farmers. It used to basically swale like this all the time. Farmers would have hated that, but it's the natural environment. And this is pretty much the extent of the Willamette Valley Project, putting 13 dams in the periphery of the valley to save water and to save the flooding action, because in the lower valley they're actually putting a little bit of money into ditching and drain tiling and draining it all off, so we have a lot less groundwater today than in the past, which can likely easily affect environments for all kinds of species. So, moving up to the McKinsey now. Done a little bit of research on the McKinsey. I could bring more in later, but I don't have much time. It turns out that McKinsey didn't have any people that lived up there. There is too cold. It's a great place to go fishing in the summer, but in the wintertime it's just too cold and nobody wants to go up there. In fact, there's very few communities up there today, and they're very small, and they're kind of like snow-locked for a while. So people would not live up there. Native people were not equipped for snow. But we do have these accounts of the Warm Springs coming over from the reservation on mountain passes and then setting up fish camps on the river and fishing there. And there's actually locations up there they call it Indian camp locations. And I've talked to a lot of people up there that talked about their parents and grandparents telling stories about how they used to see the Indian encampments up right alongside the banks of the McKinsey there, because between Blue River and McKinsey Bridge, the banks are like right on top of the river. They're so flat and so easy to set up a camp out there. And we have some information about exactly where those things were too. Those same Warm Springs people apparently in the latter 19th into the 20th century were coming down into Springfield mainly and setting up encampments alongside of the McKinsey and Coast Forks, and then they would set up fishing camp. That's the description, with drying racks for salmon and steelhead and stuff. But they would also, in the daytime, the adults would go to the local hop fields and pick hops, and so they became a regular, very dependable group of people that would come down and pick hops. And so we have lots of oral history, lots of ethnographic description of them coming down in around August. Upwards of 500 to 600 people from Warm Springs. In fact, they said they would empty the reservation in some of the accounts, coming down into this area and then setting up their encampments on the river and then going to the CV fields or other fields to pick hops. And some of the farmers even helped them out. This one from Holly Parker's dad would take a truck over and go get a bunch of people and bring them down to his encampment because he wanted those people to work for him. And then we have all these records from the Oregonian and Register Guard, or nowadays the Register Guard, of Native people coming here, picking hops for years. I think that ends around 1936. And I think the end of that year is because Kaiser Shipyards comes into being around 1934, 35. And then we find that there's a lot better jobs to be had in Portland if you go work at the Kaiser Shipyards than here in hop picking. So that's my own theory. I haven't proved it yet, but that's what I'm saying. So, and then the kids would come down with them. I mean, there was a whole family coming in sometimes their horse cart and ponies. And the kids would over the wintertime be making these leather gloves out of deer leather, and would sell that to the farmers, and the farmers loved it. And so I've actually found several examples of at least one or two gloves at Lane County Museum that has what appears to be beadwork stitched onto the backside. There's also a vest there too, which I was looking for the pictures, which I have somewhere. I couldn't find them today. But they have examples, so I'm fully almost guaranteeing that existed here. They were sold on street corners in Eugene, and so there's even an account of farmers saving their hides from the deer to give to the Indian children, so that they could take them back to Warm Springs, produce the leather goods, and bring them back to them the next season. So pretty interesting stuff. So my research nowadays, besides looking at Kalapuya culture, trying to figure out more about it, and the environment does give us a clue as to what they were living in or living with, how they may have situated their houses, how they may have walked through the valley, perhaps even how the valley environment grew up in sort of a wetland environment, not a dry prairie environment. We're starting to have questions about, whether or not we need to be using fire to sort of manage the land, because now it's all burning down around us. And I'm suggesting that, fire was removed. That's exactly right, but perhaps more important than that would be the water that was removed. We've lost a lot of groundwater. We don't have any longer the marshes and swamps and swales we used to have that would sustain the valley population. And if we want to restore landscapes, these two things need to be brought back so that we can do it in a healthy way. And that's all I have for today. Thank you.
That was wonderful. I really appreciate the in-depth knowledge and getting to learn from you. Before we begin our Q&A, a special thank you to our award-winning public radio station KLCC for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. In the metro area of Lane County, they broadcast on 89.7 FM and in Florence on 88.1 FM. For those listening at home or on your commute right now, your household is one of several thousand tuning into City Club on KLCC, and we're truly honored to have you. You can also find all recent City Club programs archived at klcc.org, as well as on our YouTube channel and the City Club of Eugene podcast. We will have a short break, so think of some wonderful questions for Dr. David, and we'll return for Q&A in a moment.
Hi. David, a million years ago when I was a researcher, I had a project that involved Terry McCarty, and she wrote a book called Southwest Memory, and she got a big federal grant to help the tribes develop written languages which they hadn't had. So Navajo, for example, Havasupai, Wallapai. Are the native languages, the local Kalapuyan languages, do they have writing? Did they ever have writing? Do they now?
They do now. They didn't. Most tribes in the world, their languages have been sort of collected by linguists or anthropologists into notebooks, field books, and so linguists have taken control of those things and have figured out linguistic writing styles and stuff. And a lot of Native people have dictionaries written now, and so there are writing styles, mainly created by linguists or tribes that have linguists working for them. So that is a thing, yes.
Cool.
Today, yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Emma. I live up in Oak Ridge, and I'm wondering if you know about the native tribes who would have lived in the Oak Ridge area. You mentioned the Mackenzie didn't have any permanent settlements. I'm also a wildland firefighter and a grad student researching cultural fire. So I'm curious if you have any anthropological record of cultural burning in the higher elevations. You mentioned a lot about the prairies, but curious about the kind of mountainous forested areas up there. Thank you.
Actually, I've been part of a team that has U of O and myself from OSU researchers on it who've been studying fire up there in the James Creek area. So, and we found a pretty good record of that. And we can't explain it except for it's probably human caused. So, and it goes back 600 years or more. It is likely that you're setting small to medium-sized fires alongside of what we call the Klamath Trail up there. And it was probably Klamath and Malala peoples. So that's what we think, yeah.
A similar question about your findings in oral history. I remember about 30 years ago, the coastal Indian tribes were were interviewed about rare events, specifically a big tsunami and everything, and they were able to get from the oral histories things that were not in our European record because they were hundreds of years ago. As I understand it, the catastrophic fires on the west side of the Cascades are similar. They only happen every few hundred years. Have we found anything in the oral history of the natives around here that reveals some of these rare but big events?
Yeah, there are some records. There's one from like 1845 or so. There's one that may be 150 years old. There's one maybe several hundred years old from Western Washington. There's several of these records out there, and I think though basically the rarity of those records suggests that there wasn't a lot of large fires, catastrophic fires that went off around here because tribes were pretty good at setting fires every year. Or every 3 to 5 years in some areas, like the forest, that would burn off most of the fuels. And so you'd only see then a catastrophic fire when the conditions are absolutely right for that, like we had in 2020, where there's really good winds going the wrong direction,
Yeah.
pretty hot, and I mean it creates the absolutely best condition for having a massive fire. So.
Have you heard of any of those right conditions affecting the valley where we live now?
I don't know. 1840. I'd have to look. I haven't looked directly at the 1845 record in terms of what we have ethnographically besides the one story we have. So I don't know. It's hard to tell because most of the valley floor has been changed, and most of the older plants have been. So we can't get it through dendro necessarily unless it's on the edges of the forest. I mean, of the valley. We perhaps could get some of it from coring of lake beds. But these are all expensive endeavors, and not everybody has been looking for these things. And I don't know if I'm necessarily the scientist for that. I could perhaps theorize that. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sharon Reed, and thanks so much for being here. I've learned a lot already. Can you give me some more information about the levels of leadership? I'm just curious on the governance within the tribal, and also with family structures, sharing childcare, or just how family structures seem to work.
That's a lot of questions, but so I mean, tribes pretty much have. A tribal council that are elected by their leaders, by their membership, and then they have executive officers that run the business affairs of the tribe, and they have officers for a lot of the departments, yeah, so they have like natural resources and sometimes education, usually education, social services, housing, things like that. They may have a school program, depends on the tribe. Every tribe is a little different, so.
I was thinking more in the back in the historical.
No, this is today. Oh, tribes were forced to move to reservations and were forced to accept, under reorganization, forced to accept a democratically elected governance in the 1930s. Before that, there were still tribal councils. And a lot of times, many tribes had men and women on those tribal councils. In some places, like in the mostly eastern and Midwest, a lot of times the women were in charge of the tribe, and they were just telling the men they could do certain things, or they had to leave. So, I mean, that's the Seneca story. So, so it's all, I mean, you can't say all tribes were matriarchal, all tribes are patriarchal. That's not the case. You have to literally look at each individual tribe. It appears that most of the Oregon tribes were a little on the patriarchal side. Men were basically in charge. But then there are these cases like the Lucky Mute where they were told by Joel Palmer, the Indian agent, to appoint a leader of their tribe because they didn't have one. So maybe they didn't need one. Maybe just people just got along and did the right thing. So, yeah, I mean, so that's, and a lot of times those leadership do go in families. People are trained from an early age to be leaders of the tribe and be able to speak well and think well of their people. A lot of positions in the tribe are that way. People are trained from a childhood to take that position later on. Yeah. Thank you.
I was interested in the very end of your talk. Thank you. Yeah.
For the radio.
In the very end of your talk, you mentioned an example of the reciprocity of the gloves and the settlers giving. Did they give or did they sell the hides to the children, and then they could make the gloves and sell them? So I was wondering about, maybe you could clarify that, but also examples of a reciprocity that might have worked to bring cooperation between the two, the colonizers and colonized.
So Native people tended to like to make long-term relationships with people. So if they had established a good relationship with a farmer in the area, they would have come back to their farm every year and be a pretty consistent workforce for them in harvesting. So that relationship is a little more community-based. It's a little more trade relationship. I can't say that money didn't exchange hands, probably did. But it's all about goodwill and community goodwill, and they're going to help you out if you help them out. And so that's a community. That's what communities do for each other. That it's not always about money. Nowadays it's all about money, but back then it wasn't so much. So I would bet that if the kids were getting these deer hides, they would not charge a huge amount of money for them. Not that they were getting a lot anyway. It's just raw material, really. And maybe it was part of the pay that they gave the adults for work in the fields. I don't know. There's not a lot of specificity in those accounts as to what the relationship was. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm interested in the gender division of labor and how that existed before the white incursion into the tribes. So you mentioned that it was primarily a culture that based on what I would call horticulture. It wasn't using the plow, right?
Yeah, they had no
Corn wasn't here yet. So I mean, did women go to the fishing camps? Were women there? What do we know about the whole gender division of labor? Because usually we think of maintaining plants as kind of a woman's occupation in a stereotypical kind of way.
Well, I think that generally when people travel to an encampment, it would be everybody there. So when you were out there hunting, generally it was the men that hunted. Then they would bring the animals back. And then it was the women that basically processed the animals and rendered them down, probably began smoking and drying the meat and stuff. They also, there's an account from Grand Ronde of people going up on Mount Hebo in family groups, and it was like the elders would stay in camp and do work around the camps. Children would be there too and have their own jobs. Men are out hunting. And while they're out hunting, they're locating huckleberry fields where there would be good picking. And so they would tell the women when they come back to camp, and the next day the women would go to those huckleberry fields and pick there. And so there was kind of a shared relationship there. Everybody has a purpose, everybody has a job, and they're doing it, so they're working together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for being here. I was wondering a little bit if you had more thoughts on like the development of settler agriculture and how that affected the foodways. I got to read your book over the fall, and I was struck by like the presence of a lot of settler farmers like in militias that were doing a lot of violence. And you know, like there's a big farming community in the valley now, like organic farming that really sees, it's like a very progressive community, but there's not a lot of like reckoning with that like early history and how the land was now, you know, transported to settlers. So I was wondering if you had some more thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, a lot of the farmers arrived before there was actually a relationship between the tribes and the United States. U.S. hadn't even bought the land yet, so they basically were, I look at them as now kind of squatting on tribal land, even though they were legally given their land titles in 1850 when, you know, they passed the Donation Land Act. So it sort of grandfathered them in to keep their land. But if you've read the book, and just for everybody else who hasn't read the book, plowing up all those fields in the valley began to destroy the native crops, you know, the camas and the other root crops and things, wild wheat crops, things like that, which began to affect tribes' abilities to feed themselves, put away food for the wintertime, do the storage stuff I talked about in my talk. And they were beginning to sort of begin to accept sort of the American foods that were coming in too. So sometimes they would trade their labor for like a horse or cow or something like that. And there are these accounts, you know, there are accounts from, I got in Brownsville, the museum there, of people, native people that were starving in the wintertime. They would go to the farmer they'd worked for the previous summer, helping build a fence or something, and asking them for some food, and the farmers would usually refuse them. So there was a very sort of stingy type attitude, you know, like we don't want to give our hard-earned crops to vagrants and thieves at that time period. But I believe they became thieves and vagrants because they're being pushed off their land, you know, by all the settlers. They hadn't sold it yet. It's their land, technically under U.S. law, and then their crops were going away, so they couldn't feed themselves anymore the way they used to. So, and there seems to be this philosophical difference between settlers that coming here and native people who had this sort of community attitude. If somebody in their community, like another native band, was starving, they would give what they had to help them out. In fact, when the settlers first got there, they didn't have farming yet for a season or so, right? So they were hosted by the tribes, fed by the tribes, and told what they could eat on the land. And that's well recorded. And so, but when tribes began to suffer, and they were refused by settlers, they went and began stealing food, as you will, to survive. So they got the reputation of thieves and vagrants. And then those statements of the bothersome natives in the valley influenced the federal government to move them onto reservations. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Speaking of food, there's restaurants and such are often, they put a lot of effort into using local grown food and all this. I've never found a source of camas. I mean, you'd think you'd find it as a specialty someplace, but I've never seen. Maybe there's a reason for why, but I'd be interested in knowing what you have to say about that.
The camas crops were pretty much destroyed by farming. So it's considered kind of a rare crop, and they take 5 to 10 years to mature enough so you can harvest them and make any kind of meal out of them. So you need quite a few fields, and I believe back in the day the tribes would do rotations of fields. They would harvest from a field and then leave it alone for 3 years and come back, similar to land rotation nowadays in farming, to let the crops basically mature again or come back. And so so in that sort of, so camas is right now can't be farmed it's very difficult to do so. There are some chefs that are doing some experiments with it. I think there's that, what's it called? It's a restaurant in Albany, downtown Albany, that's doing some work on bringing camas and other native foods onto the table. I forget the name of the restaurant, but anyway, there are some chefs that are doing some work with that, and there's some work being done by other tribal people that want to sort of figure out how to speed up the maturation process of the camas. Many tribes are against that because they see the camas as a sacred plant, so they don't necessarily want that to become commercialized. However, in terms of things like wapato, it's pretty commonly offered in Chinese markets. It's not labeled wapato, but if you look at it, it's absolutely wapato. Yeah. I showed you a picture. It's called arrowroot or arrowleaf plant, and there are many hundreds of varieties around the world. Jicama is one. Poi comes from one, from taro. So we have it. It's a pretty major sort of staple that originally was in the Portland area, a lot in the Portland area until they destroyed it all because they did a lot of dredging of the river. They're trying to bring it back at Lake Labiche in some areas, and Wapato Lake is coming back. It does grow. I mean, it's got very distinctive sort of arrow-looking leaves, and after about 3 to 5 years, you can usually harvest it, and it has pretty big bulbs. Yeah. Usually around September, when the leaves start to decline, is when you want to harvest.
Couple questions. One, at the height of the Kalapuya, how many people were in the tribe? And number two, can you talk about the descendants of the Kalapuya today? Where are they? What they're doing?
There's one right here.
Okay. Anybody else, you know?
Yeah, there's about a couple thousand of us at Grand Ronde. So, yeah, all the Kalapuyans in 1856 were moved to Grand Ronde, so you need to fix your history there a little bit. So they all went to Grand Ronde, and sometime later on, a few people married into Siletz over there. What were your other question? I'm sorry? You had a lot of questions.
The numbers.
Oh, yeah, numbers. So our estimate is somewhere in the 16,000 range, but that's after Lewis and Clark comes through and has their own estimates. The problem with Lewis and Clark is they never met a single Kalapuya person, so they just estimated it for the valley. And there was a smallpox epidemic that came through in the 1770s, late 1770s, so we don't know exactly how many people died from that. We figure like a third. That's usually the case with what they call a virgin population. But with malaria, we lost 97%. So I don't know if it would have made any difference by the time malaria comes along. So we go from maybe a high of 16,000, as far as we know, down to less than 1,000 people. And there are, I think, in total, something like 600 people moved to Grand Ronde that have some Kalapuya ancestry in 1856.
Thank you. I'm curious, as a scholar, are there lessons from history that pertain to today's quote-unquote immigration enforcement debate that we're seeing playing out on our streets and in our media, whether you have any sort of historical lessons you can share or simply how you've been receiving it?
I mean, that's a hugely loaded question, right? I mean, seriously, that's just colonization all over again, what's happening. I mean, we haven't learned from the past. People, these same statements have been made by peoples going back 200 years or more in the United States. Native people, blacks, Latinos, Irish, Italian, Jews. I mean, how many different ethnicities came in from different places and were treated that way? Chinese, Japanese, and this is in Oregon too. So anyway, it's absolutely parallels to that. And for whatever reason, I guess you didn't get an A in history or something, but yeah, absolute parallels. Yeah.
My question is about group identity. Supposing you were a traveler through the region from an outside group, from your American group probably, and you somehow managed to have a conversation with people from the Kalapuya group, and you asked them, what do you identify as? Would there be a clear identification? I'm sure it wouldn't be exactly the word Kalapuya, but something like that? Or would it be more diffuse, like we interact with this group over there, but we're not utterly a part of them?
Well, there wasn't one Kalapuya tribe. Like I showed you, there was numerous people. They generally call themselves after the place they're living in. So if you look at those names, they usually mean place of Camas or place of Wapato or place of, that's generally what it means, or high mountain place or whatever it is. We just don't understand Kalapuya that well to sort of really ferret out what those things mean. So most people didn't call themselves Kalapuya. In fact, linguists think that Kalapuya word maybe come from another language, perhaps Chinook or something. Other folks have believed that maybe it means people of the grasslands. I mean, who knows? But most people would call themselves people in their own language, so, yeah.
Gunakshish, for your talk, really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I live in Alaska next to a river, the Chilkat River, which has a very large Ulican run.
Okay.
And I want you to maybe explain the connection between Ulican and Oregon.
Yeah, well, people read the article, right? They forgot to mention that we wrote an article about that, but in 2001. It was a researcher, Scott Byram, if you know him, and myself. We had this idea. We were talking about looking at the origin of the word Oregon. We'd heard a lot of theories about French and perhaps Spanish words that could have been transformed into Oregon. But we started following the historic record of how Thomas Jefferson heard the name in the first place, and sent Lewis and Clark here to find what he said was the origin of the River Oregon. And it turns out these guys, Rogers and Carver, explorers back in the day, fur traders, kind of had brought the word to him, and we theorized that maybe the original word was Ooligan, because there's a pretty significant trade history up in the upper northwest coast, north of Puget Sound, people turning Ooligan smelt into really finely processed grease, using, they let it rot in a basin, usually sometimes a canoe, and then they ladle off the fine oil on top of that several times, and then they, at room temperature or temperature outside, it turns into a solid, kind of like butter, and then they pack that into these cedar boxes. They would make these bentwood cedar boxes that were completely watertight, and so they would carry those boxes over their coast range into the interior and trade that Ooligan grease to the interior folks, who would then trade with people further to the east, people like the Chippewa and Assiniboine people that would travel across the Great Plains, which is also in Canada, to the Great Lakes, and then that's how the word would have transferred, we theorize, from the Northwest Coast to the Great Lakes, which is where Rogers and Carver heard the word. And we thought that, so we used nutrition studies, because there's been these people in Canada that have looked at the nutrition of the grease, and it appears that fish oils and fish greases are pretty well used by northern folks because there's not a lot of vitamin C growing up there. So that those vitamins get trapped in fish blubber or mammal blubber. So that's why grease and blubber and fat is good up there. And we thought that maybe there would be a linguistic switch from Ooligan to Oregon, And there is, in the Cree language, or Chippewa language, there is this RL switch. So we thought that maybe we're not linguists, we haven't proved it, but we are suggesting that maybe that was the case. So for whatever it's worth, that's what we wrote up. It's a lot of different evidence for different things, so.
I have a question about depictions in popular media. So people who want to learn more about the Kalapuya and tribes from the surrounding area can open a history book, but if they don't, they might, do you have any recommendations around music, movies, or any other contemporary resources that are out there for learning that you think are positive or accurate depictions?
Popular media, Kalapuya. I have a book. So it doesn't sing, I don't know. I mean, people at Grand Ronde have produced at times, musical tapes, powwow songs. I think Bobby Mercier there has put together some songs, some drum songs. I think they're downloadable. They're called Chinook songs, or I forgot the name of his tape, but he's got them online. There are the tribal website itself has things you can watch, like videos and things about how to do cultural things. So check that out. You can always go to the museum. They probably have more stuff there. T'Challa Museum is open to the public. I think it's like 10 to 4 most days, even Saturdays. So I would call ahead to make sure, but because they'll usually close at a funeral or something like that. So, but they have lots of displays, exhibits up there, information. Yeah, I'm not sure. There's not a ton out there. You have to really be a nerdy researcher like me to find this stuff. So.
Thanks for being here, Professor, the third time. We always love having you, so hopefully you'll come back for a fourth time.
Yeah.
My question is about labor. You mentioned how people would come down and engage in agricultural labor.
Yeah.
To what extent were members of the tribes involved in industrial labor, timber labor, other kinds of labor that developed after white settlers moved in?
I think pretty extensively. I think some people would leave the reservations. Sometimes they had to get permission to do so. Some people just left and did it anyway. And they would be part of various settler industries, whether they're canning, fishing, timber, sawmills. A lot of folks at Grand Ronde and maybe lots of other tribes went into timber falling, and there's a pretty well-known history of native loggers out there, and they usually can become, at some level, the leader of their group, their outfit, because they really understand the forest and they're in there for their career. So, and now we have histories at Grand Ronde, so lots of people being 4 and 5 generations in a logging family. I've written about that pretty extensively. So, yeah, I mean that's, and then there was lots of people that went into Kaiser shipyards when that was a thing. So there's a huge history of Native people going there from local reservations and being part of, being literally the Rosie the Riveters in the room, because a lot of women and people who didn't go to war went into shipbuilding. So yeah.
Mary Layton, one more question. I've been in schools all my life, and at some point, not that long ago, there was a new curriculum unrolled, tribal history, shared history. How's that going? Who are the stars in implementing this so that the children of Oregon hear about our times immemorial?
Well, the state of Oregon passed that law, I think, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, SB 13, and they got some curriculum written. They hired a firm in Portland to do so. Tribes also produce units for the curriculum, and much of that is online. There's a few tribes that haven't produced anything yet, but it's all available online to use what they have. The problem is there was never any money in the bill for training teachers how to teach the curriculum. I know the state of Oregon, the Department of Education has done some work in local communities trying to train a few teachers here and there, I guess the assumption is they're going to go back and teach other teachers, but that's not really how it works. And I haven't yet seen that there's any kind of a pushback to the universities to suggest that their teachers go through like ethnic studies or Native studies training so they can actually effectively use that curriculum in the classroom. So a lot of schools are still relying upon Lewis and Clark and Oregon Trail for their curriculum when that's not really a native curriculum at all. So I've heard a few schools, perhaps Beaverton is doing well, a few schools in Portland are doing well. I've heard of a few scattered places where some teacher has had some time and they put extra time into developing the curriculum for their school, their classes. But generally, it's not being offered, from what I know. And I think the other problem is money, clearly. I mean, who has time and money? Nobody's getting paid to do extra work to modify this curriculum for your classroom. So if there was more money for training teachers in these areas, then I think you'd be offered more often.
It brings me no pleasure to share that that's all the time we have for today. Please join me in thanking Dr. David G. Lewis. This has been our January 30th, 2026 conversation at the City Club of Eugene. We'll be back at our usual location, the Wow Hall in downtown Eugene, next Friday, February 6th at noon. That program is called A History of Exclusion, the Black Eugene Experience and the Black Cultural Initiative. It's sure to be a great forum, and we're looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you all. Have a great weekend or week, and see you next time at City Club.